pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
And congratulations on the publication of your first book.
Thank you so much.
I think this kind of project, one of the questions that always emerges in terms of how you came to think about it is, other than James Baldwin, in writing this book, who were the primary intellectual interlocutors that you were thinking with as you were parsing through the material and thinking about this project as a whole?
Yeah. So the primary interlocutors for me would be, the first one would be Jose Esteban Munoz and his work, his queer color critique and his work specifically Disidentifications. I came across his work during graduate school and I was blown away because I read his work Disidentifications and I was like, oh no, I think this is perhaps the best way to engage Baldwin around what he's doing with religion, religious symbols, theology, etc. in his work. And so Disidentifications, this idea that queer folks will sometimes take phenomena that are hostile to the community and then reshape them, retool them, reimagine them in such a way as to contribute perhaps to queer life and perhaps queer liberation, really blew my mind. And I was like, no, I think this is what Baldwin's doing with religious symbols. And so that was one primary interlocutor. Another would be a collection of folks who are doing work at the intersection of religion and race. So specifically, I was thinking of my mentor, Sylvester Johnson, who's currently at Virginia Tech, and the ways in which Johnson examines how Black religion arose in this nexus of commerce, colonialism, etc. And then he also puts it into conversation with the kind of the formation of race itself. And so I was thinking about Johnson as I'm reading Baldwin, because Baldwin has a very similar way of engaging the way in which Christianity contributes to the rise of even whiteness, right? And so I was thinking about that kind of body of work, and not just Sylvester Johnson, but also Geraldine Hing and others who are doing work around the racialization of religious identities. And so putting Baldwin into conversation with them as well. And then also, I put Baldwin into conversation with a number of Black feminist and Black studies figures, whether that was Sylvia Wynter, Nikki Giovanni, Audre Lorde, etc., particularly in my fourth chapter, engaging Baldwin around what I would say is the problems Baldwin has with gender and his narration of Black women. And so those are the figures that come most to mind.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Baldwin has this incredibly complicated relationship with the sort of tradition and history of Black feminist thought, as you're already laying out through this intellectual history. And one question I have is, how do you see this book and its reevaluation of Baldwin's legacy as potentially opening new pathways in Black, queer, and religious studies, each on their own, as a collection?
Yeah, so what I hope this book would do, I wanted this to be a kind of fresh engagement of Baldwin from the side of kind of Black religious studies. Because up to this point, and with some notable exceptions, most of the folks who've engaged Baldwin have engaged him solidly, within Black religious studies, from the standpoint of theology. And I wanted to, in essence, kind of trouble Baldwin's relationship to not only Black religious studies in general, but also Black theology. And so I wanted to offer a kind of robust engagement of Baldwin in relationship to not bracketing his queerness, not bracketing any of the complicated parts of Baldwin's life and work, and kind of bring them together richly into a genuinely, what I understand to be not even interdisciplinary, but almost anti-disciplinary way. And so in essence, what I hoped is that my engagement with Baldwin would open up windows in Black religious studies that would allow Black religious scholars to begin to think about, what does religion look like for Black queer folks, that doesn't Christianize the discourse, or it doesn't Christianize what they're doing and their practice and their beliefs, right? But also at the same time, understands Black queer spaces as generative spaces for talking about spirituality and religion. And also recognizing that Black queer spirituality, Black queer religion, as reflected in Baldwin's work, is so intensely queer. It's difficult to categorize, to try to locate it in a very particular way. Baldwin is transgressing boundaries all over the place in his work when it comes to religion. And so I was trying to get away from a tendency that I found with some scholars to want to Christianize him. And I wanted to say, like, no, Baldwin's very queer spirituality is in fact that. It is queer. Therefore, we cannot position it easily, comfortably in any particular tradition.
Yeah. I mean, James Baldwin in many ways is this figure that gets kind of hemmed in a variety of different ways. I mean, most people get exposed to him as either a literary figure or an essayist, but fewer people understand him as a product of a profoundly religious world. How do you imagine and work to reconcile or negotiate those two Baldwins, both in your book and in the way you think about this project?
Yeah. And so I think my goal was to try to capture Baldwin in his complexity. And so sometimes folks who engage Baldwin solidly as a kind of a literary figure, they have a tendency to say, well, Baldwin was, in essence, just kind of rhetorically playing with religious language, right? It was a tool he utilized in his work that is directly related, in essence, to the culture. And I wanted to say, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because despite the fact that Baldwin came of age in, the Black Sanctified Church or Black Pentecostal Church, left that church while still a teenager, he continued to engage the world through its symbols and its rhetoric consistently, and whether that's in his essays or in his novels, right? And so you can't separate the two because they weren't separated in his own mind. So even if Baldwin was doing a radical critique of the church, Baldwin was often turning its symbols towards the church in offering and leveraging that critique. So I began to think about, I was like, no, we need to think about complexly what Baldwin is doing with those symbols, and rather than just engaging him just as, Baldwin the activist or Baldwin the writer, I wanted to try to capture him in that, that full sense, and know that the religious history, the religious symbols, the religious critique all inform every aspect of his work. And you can see this in the ways he opens so many of his texts with hymns, with scripture, with Black church idiom, just in the way that his characters speak and engage. It's just all over the place. So it has something to say. His centering of Black religious life and rhetoric and symbols in that way, it has something to say. And so I want to make sure that that was coming forth in the book.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most amazing aspects of the book to me is its footnotes, of which there are 950. They make the book read like two parallel conversations. One is the primary body, the narrative, and then there's this meta-narrative where you're situating it in so many complicated ways. Could you talk about how you constructed the book and approached the role of the footnotes, the role of all of these parts coming together? What is the architecture of this book?
Yeah. So in essence, I wanted the book to, just like as a scholar, as a writer, I'm the byproduct of a community of people individuals who poured into me, who shaped my life, shaped my story in very particular ways. I kind of view my academic life in a similar way, in that I am not articulating, a kind of singular voice, right? I wanted the text to read in such a way as it felt like a communal conversation with other Baldwin scholars, with other Black scholars, with other, Black studies thinkers, right? Because I wanted it to, I think it adds to the richness of the. I think it adds to the richness of the work, right? And I think there's a certain intellectual humility in admitting, that this you are not a kind of singular entity that just kind of I've just been coming up with all this stuff on my own. It's like no. I am the byproduct of an intellectual community that has been thinking about Baldwin for a very long time, and so I wanted to make sure that my work was not just offering a kind of nod to the scholarship that came before, but was engaging it in a really robust way, because I think not only is their work deserving of that, it only makes my work better to show like, no, I'm very conversant with whether that is Josiah Ulysses Young or Clarence Hardy, who both of which have written on Baldwin in relation to religion in a very particular way, or the work of Matthew Brehm, who's written about Baldwin and queerness, all the black feminist thinkers who've been writing about Baldwin and gender that show up in my 4th chapter. I wanted to make sure that I was centering those folks as well, because I think, again, it is a communal conversation. We can't engage Baldwin, this figure who wrote over the course of decades, alone.
Yeah, I mean, what ultimately through this conversation and as this rich history of thought around Baldwin, what tools do you see religious studies specifically offering in navigating our changing understanding of faith, identity, belief, and Baldwin as a legacy?
Yeah, I think religious studies in particular offers us a way in which to recognize in Baldwin's work the depth of his religious thinking, and recognizing that, okay, Baldwin is not simply just simply toying with religious rhetoric. It's like, no. I think religious studies and the hermeneutics and the methodologies it offers allows us to say like, no, something else is going on here. There's something deeper here in the way that he's utilizing the symbols. And so I think that religious studies is so helpful in recognizing, for instance, as I talk about in my 1st chapter, how Baldwin is actually reimagining and queering the category of conversion itself. I think without my religious studies background, I would have missed the depths of what he was actually articulating in framing a scene of queer sexuality between 2 young men as a life-changing and transforming experience. Yes, it was life-changing and transforming, but Baldwin's also framing it as a type of conversion. That little small piece of it, even in the ways that he utilizes hymns in that scene, would be missed if I didn't have that religious studies lens to recognize like, no, he's doing something different there. And I also think that religious studies as a discipline, and I think, and this is something that I can remember my mentor, Sylvester Johnson, saying at one point, it teaches us to read deeply. And with a certain level of complexity, right? Not just contemporary text, but even ancient text, right? And so we're engaging text in at always looking, getting to the depths, trying to tease out what is an author actually saying. So I was trained to read in a very particular way. And I think that is so helpful in engaging someone like Baldwin, who has layers upon layers upon layers of meaning in his writing, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Now that you've completed this incredible book, what other projects, ideas, directions do you imagine pursuing in your career?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've been thinking about what perhaps I'm stating a bit too strongly, my post-Baldwin life. It'll never be post-Baldwin, but I've been thinking about specifically in essence the spirituality of Black queerness. Thinking about and so I'm thinking with figures like Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, talking about orientation, wanting to put Sarah Ahmed into conversation with figures like Charles Long, who also talk about orientation and religion as orientation, and thinking about what is the orientation, what is the religious orientation, the spiritual orientation of Black queerness, of Black queer lives, right? What is the kind of anchoring points for Black queer folks, right? That reveal a kind of ultimate concern, to borrow Tillich's language. What is the the contours of the ways in which we, you know, what is the spirituality of the way we do relationships, the way we queer sexuality, the various aspects of our practices. So I've just been thinking about a lot about Black queerness as a kind of spiritual and religious modality in and of itself, and wanting to do some work around Black queer practices and to look at its rituals, to look at its understandings of spirit, to look at its connection with nature, to look at all of these things and kind of theorize about the meaning of Black queerness in that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I look forward to talking with you more.
Thank
as we
you.
move forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.